I have more important things to deal with tonight, Marcus. She said it while zipping up a work bag she'd already packed twice, standing in our kitchen in the blazer she usually saved for board presentations. On the one night of the year I'd built a small, stupid ritual around for 15 years running. My name is Marcus, and I want you to understand that I'd heard Sarah cancel things before. She ran a hospital's operations department, cancellations came with the job, but I'd never once heard her cancel this particular thing, and something about the specific flatness in her voice told me this wasn't about a crisis at the hospital at all. It's our anniversary, I said, which felt like a strange thing to have to remind my own wife of, 15 years in. I know what day it is. She didn't look up from her bag. There's a situation with the new wing funding that I have to be present for. I already told you this might happen. I can't just walk away from it because of a dinner reservation. I stood in that kitchen holding a bottle of wine I'd picked specifically because it was the same label we'd had at our wedding, and I felt something small and quiet crack inside my chest, not loud, not dramatic, just a hairline fracture in something that had been holding steady for a long time. I teach high school history and coach junior varsity football at the same school I'd graduated from myself, back when Chattanooga still felt like a small town instead of the growing city it had become. Sarah ran operations at Ridgeline Memorial, one of the two major hospitals in town, and had spent the last 6 years working her way up under a director named David Chen, 47, sharp, ambitious in the specific way that made board members trust him and made everyone under him work 80-hour weeks without complaint, because complaining felt like admitting you weren't tough enough to keep up. We'd married when I was 23, Sarah 21, both of us still finishing degrees, both of us broke and certain in that particular way you're only certain at 21. 15 years, 2 kids, Ava, 14, sharp-tongued and increasingly private in the way teenagers get right before you lose the easy access you used to have to their inner life, and Noah, 10, still young enough to want to sit next to me on the couch every evening. I'll be home late, Sarah said, grabbing her keys. Don't wait up. She left. I stood there another few minutes holding the wine, listening to her car pull out of the driveway, and I did something I'm not proud of admitting now. I opened the bottle anyway and drank 2 glasses alone at the kitchen table while Ava did homework upstairs and Noah watched something on his tablet in the living room, both of them apparently unbothered by the absence of a mother on an evening I'd built into something meaningful for a decade and a half. I want you to sit with that image, because it matters for everything that follows. A man alone at his own anniversary dinner, drinking wine meant for 2, telling himself this was reasonable, this was normal, hospitals have emergencies, this is just what marrying someone with a demanding career means. I've told myself a lot of reasonable things over the years. That night was just the first time the reasonableness didn't quite hold together the way it usually did. Around 11, I texted her. Hope everything's okay. Miss you tonight. No response. I fell asleep on the couch waiting for headlights in the driveway, and woke up at 2 in the morning to an empty house, Sarah's side of the bed still made when I finally dragged myself upstairs, her phone location, something I'd never once checked in 15 years of marriage, and only checked that night out of a mounting unease I couldn't quite name, showing her still at the hospital, or near it, at 2 in the morning on our anniversary. By the time she got home at 4:30, I was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark. She came in quietly, clearly assuming I was asleep, and something about the careful way she moved, the way she set her bag down without letting it thud, the way she slipped off her shoes at the door instead of by the bed like she normally did, told me, before she said a single word, that whatever had kept her at that hospital until 4:30 in the morning had nothing to do with funding for a new wing. "You're up," she said, startled, when she saw me sitting there. "I never went to sleep," I said. I kept thinking about how strange it is that a funding meeting runs past 4 in the morning. She didn't answer that. And in the silence that followed, the first real silence of many that would define the next several months of my life, I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected to arrive so suddenly, that by morning, in every way that mattered, I was already gone from that marriage. I just hadn't packed a bag yet. To understand how we got to that kitchen, you have to understand who Sarah was before David Chen, and who I was too, because neither of us arrived at that anniversary night as strangers to our own marriage's slow erosion. We'd just each been managing our piece of it separately, quietly, for longer than either of us wanted to admit. Sarah grew up the only child of two academics in Knoxville, raised in a house that valued achievement in a way that left little room for anything else. Her parents loved her, I believe that completely, but love in that house came wrapped in expectation, grades, awards, the right college, the right career trajectory. She told me once, early in our relationship, that she couldn't remember a single dinner growing up where someone hadn't asked about her latest test score before asking how she was doing. She built her entire adult identity around being exceptional at her job, because being exceptional was the only language of worth she'd ever really been taught. I understood that about her. I loved that about her, honestly, for most of our marriage, her drive, her competence, the way she ran a hospital department like a conductor running an orchestra, every piece moving because she'd anticipated exactly where it needed to be. What I didn't understand, not fully, not until much later, was how much that same drive left her vulnerable to anyone who recognized her competence out loud, who made her feel seen for the exceptional work rather than just relied upon for it. Her parents had relied upon her excellence. They'd rarely celebrated it the way she'd needed. I had my own blind spot, and I want to name it honestly, because this story doesn't work if I only show her failures. I am, by nature, a conflict avoider. I grew up in a house where my parents fought loudly and often, and I decided somewhere around 12 years old that I would never be a person who raised his voice at the people he loved. That decision served me well in some ways. I'm patient with my students, patient with my kids, slow to anger in a way people generally appreciate. But it also meant that for years, small resentments in my marriage went unspoken because I'd rather absorb discomfort than risk the kind of confrontation I'd watched destroy my parents' relationship. When Sarah started working longer hours, 5 and 6 years into our marriage, I didn't push back. When date nights got cancelled with increasing frequency, I told myself it was temporary. When she started seeming distracted at home, present in body but somewhere else entirely in mind, I filed it under, she's exhausted, rather than asking the harder question underneath. David became hospital director when Sarah had been at Ridgeline Memorial for about 4 years. He was, by every account I heard secondhand, brilliant, a turnaround specialist who'd been brought in specifically to fix a hospital system bleeding money, and he did it, ruthlessly and effectively, in about 18 months. Sarah worked directly under him from the start, and I remember, honestly, being glad for her. She finally had a boss who recognized her talent instead of taking it for granted the way her previous director had. She talked about him constantly in those early years of their working relationship, the way you talk about any boss whose approval you're chasing. David thinks. David wants this restructured. David finally noticed the efficiency work I did on the ER intake process. I heard all of this the way you hear background noise about your spouse's workplace, filed under boring, not significant, because why would it be otherwise? Around the 6-year mark of our marriage, our best friends as a couple, Lauren and Tom Whitfield, started having their own troubles, nothing as dramatic as what would eventually happen in our house, just the ordinary erosion of a marriage stretched thin by 2 demanding careers and 3 young kids. Lauren, Sarah's closest friend since nursing school, would come over some evenings and the two of them would sit at our kitchen table talking in low voices while Tom and I watched whatever game was on, and I never once thought to wonder what those conversations actually contained. I know now, though I didn't know it for a long time, that Lauren had noticed something shifting in Sarah well before I did, had asked her directly, on more than one occasion, whether things with David had crossed a line, and had been told, each time, some version of, "It's not what you think, we're just close because of the work." Lauren believed her, mostly, for longer than she should have. I don't blame her for that. I know how convincing Sarah can be when she's decided what story she needs someone to believe. The financial piece started small, the way these things always seem to. About 2 years before the anniversary night, Sarah began handling more of our household finances directly, a natural enough shift, since her hospital's salary had grown significantly larger than my teacher's salary, and it made sense, on paper, for her to take the lead on our budgeting and investments. What I didn't know, until much later, was that she'd also quietly taken out a home equity line of credit against our house, $11,000, drawn down in increments over about a year, funneled toward what she'd later describe, in a phrase that would haunt me, as an investment in my own professional development. I'd find out, eventually, that a meaningful chunk of that money had gone toward a leadership certification program David had personally recommended and partially arranged for her to attend, a program that involved several out-of-state conferences, several extended stays, several opportunities for two people already growing closer to spend concentrated, unsupervised time together far from home. I noticed the credit line on a bank statement about 8 months before the anniversary, a debt I hadn't known we'd taken on, and when I asked her about it, she explained it smoothly, without hesitation, as an investment in her career trajectory that would pay for itself many times over once she made director level herself. I believed her. I want to be honest about that, I believed her completely, because questioning her financial judgment felt, at the time, like questioning the one area of our life where she'd always clearly outperformed me, and some old, familiar part of me still didn't feel entitled to push back on the person who'd become the primary breadwinner in our house. Something shifted in me anyway, quietly, the way these things shift before you're ready to name them. I started noticing that Sarah came home from those out-of-state trips different, lighter in some ways, more distant in others, present at dinner but somewhere else behind her eyes. I told myself it was just the exhaustion of travel. I'd been telling myself variations of that sentence for close to 2 years by the time our anniversary finally arrived. The months leading up to the anniversary had been building toward something, though I didn't have language for it until much later, looking back with the specific clarity that only comes after you already know how a story ends. Ava, our 14-year-old, started pulling away from Sarah that spring in a way that felt different from ordinary teenage distancing. She'd always been closer to her mother than to me, they'd shared a kind of shorthand since Ava was small, inside jokes, a shared love of a particular British baking show they watched together every Sunday, and sometime around March, that ritual quietly stopped. I asked Ava once why she and Mom hadn't watched their show in a while, and she gave me a shrug so deliberately casual it was obviously covering something. "She's just busy," Ava said, in a tone that made clear she didn't believe her own explanation. I didn't push. I filed it under normal teenage moodiness, another entry in a growing file of things I was choosing not to look at too closely. I found out much later that Ava had seen a text on Sarah's phone months earlier, left open on the kitchen counter while Sarah stepped away to take a call, nothing explicit, just a message from a contact saved as DC, work, that read something like counting down the hours until Thursday, accompanied by a small red heart emoji that no work colleague, in Ava's 14-year-old but not unreasonable estimation, would send another work colleague. Ava didn't understand exactly what she was looking at, but she understood the shape of it, the way kids often do before they have the vocabulary to name what they're seeing. She never told me. She told her friend Zoe, sworn to secrecy, and carried the weight of it alone for months, growing quieter, spending more afternoons at Zoe's house than she ever had before, a withdrawal I noticed and completely misread as ordinary teenage growth away from family. Our neighbors, the Garcias, whose oldest daughter played travel soccer with Ava, started acting strange around me too that spring, though I didn't connect it to anything specific at the time. Priya Garcia, in particular, would go quiet whenever Sarah's name came up at the soccer sidelines, her usual warm chattiness replaced by something careful and controlled. I later learned that Priya had run into Sarah and David having what looked, from a distance across a hotel lobby during an out-of-town soccer tournament, like considerably more than a work dinner, the two of them seated close together, Sarah's hand briefly resting on David's forearm in a way that read, even from a distance, as more than professional. Priya hadn't known what to do with that information. She'd said nothing to me, said nothing to Sarah either, and spent months carrying an awkward, unresolved discomfort around our family that I kept misreading as some unrelated tension in the Garcias' own marriage. Lauren, Sarah's best friend, finally pushed harder around that same time. I only learned the specifics of this conversation much later, but Lauren told me that in April, she'd confronted Sarah directly, telling her she was playing with fire, and that Marcus deserves better than finding out some other way. Sarah had gotten defensive, had accused Lauren of judging something she didn't understand, and the two of them had a real falling out that spring that neither Tom nor I understood the actual cause of at the time. I remember Sarah being short with Lauren on the phone, remember the two of them not getting together for their usual Thursday coffee for several weeks, and simply assumed it was some ordinary friend drama that would resolve itself. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever had a whole circle of people around you behaving strangely, carefully, guiltily, and told yourself it probably wasn't about you at all, you understand exactly how easy it is to build an entire alternate explanation rather than face the much simpler, harder truth sitting right in the middle of the room. My own suspicion sharpened for the first time around late spring, when I noticed Sarah had started keeping her phone face down more consistently, had started taking calls in the car in the driveway instead of coming inside first, had started a habit of showering immediately upon returning from certain late meetings. That struck me. In a moment of clarity I quickly talked myself out of, as oddly specific. I found a hotel charge on our joint credit card that spring, a hotel in Nashville, dated the same weekend as a leadership conference Sarah had attended for the certification program David had recommended. The charge itself wasn't suspicious on its face. Conference hotels cost money. What struck me, weeks later when I finally cross-referenced it, was that the conference itself had ended on a Friday, and the hotel charge included a Saturday night stay that had nothing to do with any professional itinerary Sarah had shown me. I asked her about it, carefully, the way I asked about most things by then, sideways, softened, giving her every opportunity to explain it away. "Hey, I noticed the Nashville hotel had you there through Saturday. I thought the conference wrapped Friday." David wanted to debrief some of the takeaways before everyone scattered, she said, without missing a beat. "It's actually more useful that way, honestly, getting to process it while it's fresh instead of losing the thread once everyone's back in their normal routines." It was smooth. It was plausible. It was the kind of explanation that would have satisfied me completely 18 months earlier. By that spring, though, something in me had started keeping a different kind of ledger, and every smooth explanation added another entry to a column I hadn't consciously decided to start filling. She told me, much later, what those months had actually felt like from her side of things. I didn't know any of this yet, not that spring, not for a long time after. I told myself Nashville was harmless, that staying the extra night was just practical, professional. That's not true. I stayed because David asked me to, in a voice that made something in my chest go warm in a way it hadn't in years, and I told myself I could have this one thing, being genuinely seen by someone brilliant, someone who valued exactly the parts of me my whole life had trained me to value in myself, without it costing anything at home. I didn't understand yet how much it was already costing. Every time I came home from one of those trips I told myself I'd stop, that this was the last one, and every single time, another conference appeared on the calendar, another reason David needed my input specifically, and I said yes every time, telling myself it was about the work. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Something changed in Sarah, too, around this time, though I couldn't have named it clearly then, a low current of guilt beneath her usual competent surface, visible only in small tells I mostly dismissed. She started over-explaining things that didn't need explaining, offering unprompted detail about her whereabouts in a way that felt, in hindsight, less like transparency and more like preemptive defense. She flinched, once, when Noah asked innocently at dinner whether, the doctor guy, meaning David, whom the kids had met exactly twice at hospital family events, was coming to Marcus's upcoming birthday party. It was such a strange, small flinch that I noticed it and then immediately talked myself out of its significance. I want to be honest about something I did in the weeks leading up to our anniversary that I've never fully forgiven myself for, even understanding everything that came after. Rather than sitting Sarah down directly and asking her, plainly, whether something was happening with David, I chose instead to keep quietly gathering pieces, checking statements, noting patterns, building a case in my own head, because some part of me had already decided that a direct question would only produce another smooth, rehearsed answer, and I'd rather have proof than another performance I'd have to pretend to believe. I found Lauren at a school fundraiser about 3 weeks before the anniversary, cornered her near the punch bowl, and asked her directly, because I'd started to suspect, correctly, that whatever had caused the falling out between her and Sarah that spring had something to do with what I was starting to piece together myself. Lauren's face did something complicated when I asked, a mixture of relief and dread, and she told me, carefully, that she'd been worried about some things regarding David Chen, that she didn't feel it was fully her place to say more, but that she thought I deserved to ask Sarah directly rather than continuing to guess. That conversation confirmed, without giving me specifics, that I wasn't imagining anything. It also gave me a strange, unwelcome window into how many people around me had apparently been managing pieces of this knowledge for months while I remained the last one let in. I checked the home equity line of credit statement more carefully after that and found the full picture, the $11,000, drawn down over roughly 14 months, correlating almost exactly with the timeline of Sarah's growing closeness to David, correlating with conferences, with leadership development, with an entire second architecture of professional justification that had, apparently, been quietly funding an entire second life running parallel to our marriage. There was a false lead in this stretch too, one that cost me nearly 2 weeks of misdirected suspicion. I found a name, Rebecca, appearing repeatedly in Sarah's calendar alongside meetings with David, and I spent an uncomfortable stretch of time wondering if Rebecca was somehow a third party entangled in whatever was happening, before I eventually confirmed that Rebecca was simply David's executive assistant, present at every meeting for entirely mundane scheduling reasons, her presence a coincidence that had briefly sent me chasing the wrong thread entirely. I confirmed the affair's actual timeline as best I could that month, and the number that emerged landed harder than almost anything else in this whole story. It had started roughly 2 years earlier, not months, meaning it predated even the home equity line of credit, meaning Sarah hadn't drifted toward David because of some accumulating dissatisfaction with our marriage that then led her somewhere else. She'd started something with him first, for reasons that had far more to do with her own lifelong hunger to be recognized than with any specific failure of mine, and the financial entanglement, the professional development, had followed afterward as a way of dressing up something that had already begun as something else entirely. I didn't confront her with any of this before the anniversary. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for what happened that night. I walked into our anniversary dinner already knowing, in every way that counted, exactly what I was up against, though I hadn't yet decided what I was going to do about it. Some part of me, I think, was waiting to see what she'd choose to do with the one night of the year we'd always protected, waiting to see if some old loyalty to our marriage would win out over whatever was pulling her toward David, even now. I know now that wasn't fair to myself, walking into that dinner already armed with knowledge she didn't know I had. But I also understand, looking back, that I needed to see her choose, needed the anniversary itself to become the final piece of evidence, the moment where she either showed up for 15 years of marriage or didn't, without me having tipped my hand first. She didn't show up. She chose more important things, and by 4:30 that morning, sitting on the edge of our bed in the dark, I understood that whatever proof I'd still been quietly hoping wouldn't fully confirm itself had just confirmed itself completely. I didn't say much that first morning, exhausted and raw in a way that made me distrust my own judgment. I let 3 days pass, mostly on autopilot, going through the motions of work and coaching practice and dinner with the kids, while something enormous sat unaddressed between Sarah and me, both of us circling it without naming it directly. On the 4th evening, after the kids were asleep, I finally sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where, 15 years of anniversaries earlier, I'd nervously proposed with a ring I'd saved 8 months to afford. I didn't lay out a folder of evidence the way some part of me had imagined doing during those weeks of quiet investigation. I found, when the moment actually arrived, that I didn't have it in me to perform a methodical interrogation. What came out instead was rawer than I expected, less controlled than the version of this conversation I'd rehearsed. "I know about David," I said. My voice cracked on his name, which surprised me more than it should have. Sarah didn't flinch. She set down the water glass she'd been holding, very deliberately, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as calm, not cold exactly, but settled, like someone who'd already made peace, somewhere private, with the possibility of this exact moment. "Yes," she said. "It happened." That single word landed harder than any of the evidence I'd gathered over the previous months combined. I'd expected denial, deflection, some version of the smooth explanations she'd offered about Nashville and the credit line and every other question I'd asked sideways for over a year. Instead, she gave me nothing but confirmation, offered without elaboration, without an ounce of visible distress. "How long?" I said, and heard my own voice shaking. About 2 years, she said. No hesitation. No apology yet, either. Something in my chest gave way completely at that point, some structure I'd been holding upright through sheer force of will for months finally collapsing all at once. My hands started shaking. I felt tears coming and didn't try to stop them, sitting there at our kitchen table with my face in my hands, my breath coming in these ragged, uneven pulls I couldn't control. This is not something I'm ashamed to tell you now, though I was embarrassed by it in the moment, a grown man falling apart at his own kitchen table while his wife sat perfectly still across from him, watching. Say something, I managed to get out. Please. Anything. What do you want me to say, Marcus? Her voice stayed level, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. You already know. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, and I'm not going to beg you for something I'm not sure I even want. That last part, not sure I even want, hit me like a physical blow. I looked up at her, tears still running down my face, and saw something in her expression that I can only describe as distance, as though she'd already left this conversation, this house, this marriage, long before I'd finally caught up to where she already stood. 15 years, I said. 15 years, and you can just sit there like this. I've had 2 years to get used to how this feels, she said. You've had 4 days. I didn't have a response to that. I sat there for a long time, crying in a way I hadn't since I was a child, and Sarah didn't move to comfort me, didn't reach across the table, didn't offer a single physical gesture of the tenderness that had once defined 15 years of marriage. She simply watched, still, composed, waiting for whatever came next with the patience of someone who'd already rehearsed this scene countless times in her own head over the preceding 2 years. Eventually I asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything else. Why? She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I think I should tell you everything, if you actually want to hear it. Not tonight. I don't think either of us has anything left tonight. I nodded, because I didn't trust myself to speak, and went to sleep, or tried to, in Noah's old crib room, now a home office, on a pull-out couch that hadn't been unfolded in years, staring at the ceiling until dawn. Sarah came to me 4 days later, on a Saturday morning while the kids were at a sleepover Lauren had arranged, with a directness in her posture that told me she'd finally decided to say everything rather than manage it in careful pieces. I want to tell you the truth, she said. All of it. I nodded and let her talk. She told me everything. In her words, it started at a leadership retreat almost 2 years ago, a late conversation after everyone else had gone to bed, and David said something about how the operational turnaround at the hospital wouldn't have happened without my work specifically, not the department's work, mine, and I remember sitting there feeling something I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever, truly seen for being exceptional, instead of just relied upon for it. I grew up in a house where excellence was the entry fee for love, never the thing that earned it outright, and David made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, like being exceptional could actually be enough on its own. I told myself it was just professional respect at first. Then it was dinner after conferences. Then it was Nashville, and every single time I told myself it was the last time, and every single time it wasn't. I moved the money for the certification program because it gave me a legitimate reason to keep being near him, and I told myself that made it about my career rather than about him, even though I knew, underneath that story, exactly what it actually was. I was terrified the whole time, of losing you, of losing the kids' respect, of what it said about who I actually was that I kept choosing this anyway. There were nights I'd come home and see Ava's chemistry homework spread out on the table and I couldn't sit down next to her to help, because I felt like a fraud sitting in that kitchen pretending to be the mother I used to be. I don't think I can tell you I regret all of it, Marcus, and I know how terrible that sounds. What I regret is how much it cost you, and how long I let you find out on your own instead of being honest with you from the start. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I felt something I hadn't expected, not the shattering grief of the confrontation 4 days earlier, but a strange, quiet clarity, the specific relief of finally hearing the true shape of something after months of guessing at its edges. I'm not staying, I told her. I need you to understand that. She nodded, unsurprised, and said, quietly, I know. There was no fighting after that. No pleading on either side, no bargaining over the marriage itself, only, eventually, the practical negotiations of ending it. I moved out within the month, into a small rental near the school, and told Ava and Noah together with Sarah, in as calm and honest a conversation as two parents can manage while dismantling their children's sense of a stable world. Ava, it turned out, had been carrying her own piece of this for nearly a year, and when she finally told me about the text she'd seen on Sarah's phone the previous spring, I understood, with fresh grief, how much silent weight my 14-year-old daughter had been shouldering alone, convinced somehow that saying something would have made things worse rather than better. The divorce took about 6 months, uncomplicated by contest since Sarah never fought any of the terms. I didn't pursue anything punitive regarding the home equity line of credit or the diverted funds, mostly because I'd stopped wanting anything from that marriage except distance and clarity. David Chen's own marriage ended within the year as well, once his wife learned the truth through channels that had nothing to do with me, hospital administration circles, it turns out, gossip as efficiently as any small town. He kept his position at Ridgeline Memorial. Sarah eventually left the hospital for a director role at a different system altogether, a fresh start she seemed, by every account I heard through mutual friends, determined to build cleanly this time. I didn't leave that marriage angry, not by the time it actually ended. I left it quieter than I expected, carrying a strange kind of grief for a version of us that might have survived if either of us had said harder things sooner, if I'd pushed back against my own instinct to avoid conflict at all costs, if she'd brought her hunger to be truly seen to me instead of somewhere else entirely. I understand now that my conflict avoidance, my years of absorbing small erosions without ever naming them out loud, built exactly the kind of silence a story like hers could grow inside undisturbed. That doesn't make what she did right. It just means I've had to sit with my own share of what let it happen. I never looked back, not in the sense of wanting to return. Some mornings I still think about that anniversary dinner, the wine I drank alone at the kitchen table, and I feel something less like anger now and more like a strange gratitude, that the one night I'd always protected turned out to be the night that finally showed me, without ambiguity, exactly where I actually stood. The cruelest detail in this story isn't the affair itself, or even the 2 years it lasted, it's Sarah's stillness at the kitchen table, the complete absence of visible distress when she finally admitted the truth, because that stillness reveals something the confrontation alone couldn't. She had already grieved this marriage privately, on her own timeline, long before Marcus ever got the chance to grieve it with her. He was 4 days into a loss she'd been quietly processing for 2 years. What's easy to overlook, focusing only on Marcus's devastation, is that Sarah's hunger to be truly seen was real, rooted in a childhood that taught her love was conditional on excellence rather than freely given. That doesn't excuse the affair. It explains why David's specific brand of recognition landed on her with the force it did, and the story is more honest for holding both truths, her genuine wound and her genuine betrayal, without flattening either one to make the other easier to judge. The real turning point wasn't the anniversary night at all. It was 2 years earlier, at a leadership retreat neither Marcus nor the reader ever sees directly, when Sarah chose to let herself be seen by someone other than her husband instead of bringing that unmet need home. Everything after that, the hotel charges, the credit line, the anniversary cancellation, was simply the slow surfacing of a decision that had already been made in private, long before anyone around them, however uneasily, started noticing the signs. This story ultimately isn't about one cancelled dinner. It's about how two people can spend years managing separate silences under the same roof, his conflict avoidance, her old hunger for recognition, until the accumulated weight of both silences becomes heavier than the marriage built to hold them. Which leaves a question worth carrying past this particular story: how many of us are quietly avoiding the harder conversation right now, telling ourselves we're keeping the peace, when what we're actually doing is postponing a reckoning that's coming regardless of how long we manage to put it off? I still think about that bottle of wine, opened and poured for two, drunk alone at a kitchen table on the one night I'd protected for 15 years. It wasn't the affair that broke something in me that night, I didn't even know about it yet, not officially. It was sitting there alone, finally admitting to myself that I'd been managing a slow erosion for a very long time and calling it patience. What stays with me now is how much of my own life I spent avoiding hard conversations because I was terrified of becoming the kind of loud, unhappy household I grew up in, and how that fear, in its own quiet way, built a silence just as costly as any shouted argument might have been. If you've ever avoided saying the harder thing because keeping the peace felt safer, I understand that instinct completely. I just don't think it's actually as safe as it feels. If there's a hard conversation you've been avoiding, or a moment you already knew something was wrong and told yourself it wasn't your place to ask, leave one word for it in the comments below. I read every single one, and thank you, honestly, for sitting with this story all the way to its end.